12 men have walked on the moon. Only 6 are still alive today. And for decades, one of them carried a secret that had nothing to do with rocks, radiation, or classified footage. A secret about what happened inside him after he came home. Charles Duke stood on the lunar surface in 1972, drove a rover across an alien landscape, and became one of the most celebrated astronauts in American history. And then, for years, he told almost no one that the proudest achievement of his life had left him feeling hollow. This is the real story of what Charles Duke finally admitted, not about the moon's surface, but about himself. Charles Duke grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the son of a Navy man, drawn to airplanes almost as soon as he could walk. He went to the U.S. Naval Academy, then into the Air Force, then into the elite, unforgiving world of test piloting, where a single mistake could be the last one you ever made. Test pilots in that era were a strange breed, men who volunteered, again and again, to fly aircraft that had never been flown before, simply to find out what would happen. Duke thrived there. He was known as calm, precise, and relentlessly competent, the kind of man other pilots wanted next to them in the cockpit when something went wrong. In 1966, NASA selected him as part of its 5th group of astronauts, a group that would go on to fly some of the most consequential missions of the entire Apollo program. Duke's first brush with history came before he ever left the ground. On July 20th, 1969, he was the voice of Mission Control, the capsule communicator, Capcom, talking Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin down onto the surface of the moon. It was Duke's southern drawl the world heard crackling back from Houston in the tense final seconds before touchdown, and it was Duke who spoke the words that let the whole planet finally exhale. "Roger, tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." 3 years later, it was his turn. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972, carrying Duke, Mission Commander John Young, and Command Module Pilot Ken Mattingly toward the lunar highlands near the crater Descartes. Duke was 36 years old, and when he stepped onto the surface, he became the 10th human being, and, at that point, the youngest, to walk on the moon. Over the next 3 days, he and Young logged more than 70 hours on the surface, driving the lunar rover across rugged, crater terrain, collecting samples that geologists would study for decades, and completing an EVA schedule so demanding that mission planners had built in almost no room for error. By every technical measure, Apollo 16 was a triumph. NASA called it one of the most scientifically productive missions of the entire program. Duke and Young had done everything asked of them, and done it close to flawlessly. When the crew splashed down on April 27, 1972, Duke came home to the full weight of what it meant to be an American hero in that era. There were parades. There was a visit to the White House. There was a world tour, cheering crowds, magazine covers, kids who wanted his autograph because he had walked where no one else ever had. Duke gave interview after interview. He talked about the geology of the highlands, the handling of the rover, the low-gravity bounce of walking in a spacesuit, the almost unbearable beauty of the Earth hanging over the horizon like a blue and white marble in a black sky. He was articulate, humble, and endlessly patient with reporters who asked him the same questions again and again. By every outward sign, Charles Duke had reached the summit of what a human life could achieve. And that is exactly the part of a story most people never heard, because underneath the interviews and the applause, something in Duke was quietly falling apart. For years afterward, in later interviews he would eventually give, not conspiracy claims, not classified secrets, but plain, personal honesty. Duke described what that period actually felt like from the inside. He had believed, the way a lot of driven, high-achieving people believe, that reaching the goal would finally deliver the peace he was chasing. Walk on the moon, and surely the restlessness would stop, command the respect of an entire nation, and surely the emptiness would fill in. Instead, he came home from one of the rarest experiences any human being has ever had, and found that nothing on the inside had changed at all. He was still restless. His marriage, to his wife Dottie, was under real strain. He threw himself into new ventures, new business pursuits, searching for the next achievement that might finally do what walking on the moon hadn't. He left NASA in 1975, only a few years after Apollo 16, and moved into private business, eventually launching several ventures of his own. From the outside, it looked like another chapter of the same success story. The astronaut turned entrepreneur, still driven, still capable, still winning. But Duke would later describe those years, quite openly, as some of the emptiest of his life. He had climbed about as high as a person can climb. He had done something fewer than a dozen human beings in all of history had ever done, and it hadn't fixed anything. The turning point, when it eventually came, wasn't a NASA press conference or a triumphant announcement. It was quiet, personal, and almost accidental. Around 6 years after his flight, Duke's wife Dottie, who had been going through her own crisis in their strained marriage, became a committed Christian and began urging him to consider his faith seriously. Duke was skeptical. He was, by his own description, a man who trusted data, engineering, and hard evidence, not the kind of person inclined to take anything on faith alone. But watching the change in his wife, and increasingly desperate for something that might actually address the hollowness he'd been carrying since the moon, he began, reluctantly, to engage with the question. What followed was not instantaneous. Duke wrestled seriously with some of the same tensions many people wrestle with when questions of faith and science collide, including, by his own account, real doubts about how a career built on rigorous scientific training could be reconciled with religious belief. He has spoken since about praying through those doubts, essentially telling himself that he couldn't prove what he was choosing to believe, but that he was choosing to accept it anyway. It was a decision, not a lightning bolt. And once he made it, he has said, something shifted in him that 71 hours on the lunar surface, a ticker tape parade, and a standing ovation from the President of the United States had never managed to touch. This is the part of Charles Duke's story that took him years to say publicly, and it is worth sitting with because it inverts almost everything the popular imagination assumes about astronauts. We tend to picture spaceflight as the ultimate mountaintop experience, the place where a human being finally sees the whole picture and comes back transformed. And for some astronauts, in some ways, that's true. Many of the Apollo crews have described a genuine, well-documented psychological and even spiritual shift that comes from seeing the entire Earth suspended in space, a phenomenon researchers now call the overview effect, a sudden, visceral sense of the planet's fragility and unity that's very different from just knowing those facts intellectually. Astronauts across multiple missions, from multiple countries, have independently described some version of this. It's real, it's been studied, and it's one of the most consistently reported experiences in the history of human spaceflight. But Duke's honesty adds something the overview effect narrative usually leaves out. Seeing the Earth from the moon moved him, but it didn't heal him. He has said this almost bluntly in later interviews. The walk on the moon did not change his life. The achievement itself, however extraordinary, could not do the one thing he'd quietly hoped it would do. That distinction matters, because it means the most dramatic physical journey a human being can take, leaving the Earth entirely, standing on another world, looking back at the entire human species reduced to a small blue disk in the blackness, still wasn't the same as an internal transformation. Duke didn't find peace in space. He found it, years later, back on Earth, in a much quieter and much less photogenic decision to trust something he couldn't prove. Once he'd made that decision, Duke didn't keep it to himself forever, but he also didn't rush to make it his public identity. For a long stretch, he continued giving the kind of interviews the public expected from an Apollo astronaut. Technical recollections, mission details, Cold War-era space race context, the mechanics of driving a rover across the Descartes Highlands. It was only later in his life, well into his 70s and 80s, that Duke began speaking openly and often about the faith crisis that had followed him home from the moon, giving talks to church groups, sitting for extended interviews with religious broadcasters, and eventually working with organizations like the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association to tell the fuller version of his story. In those later interviews, he's been direct about the sequence of events. An astronaut who had achieved literally one of the rarest things a human can achieve, who came home more empty than when he left, and who found something to fill that emptiness in a decision that had nothing to do with rockets, engineering, or fame. It's a strange kind of reveal when you actually sit with it. Not the sort of secret that fits into a dramatic thumbnail, but arguably a more unsettling one, because it says something about achievement itself. Charles Duke did not fail to reach the goal. He reached it about as completely as a human being can reach any goal. He is one of only 12 people in the history of our species to have stood on the surface of another world. And by his own account, that accomplishment, the parades, the headlines, the place in history books forever, left an ache in him that took years and a completely different kind of journey to address. There's a reason this part of his story matters more than any speculative claim about strange lights or anomalous readings ever could. Duke's actual testimony isn't about the moon hiding something from us. It's about success hiding something from all of us, the quiet, common experience of climbing to the very top of a mountain other people would sacrifice everything to reach, and discovering that the view from up there doesn't automatically fix what's broken inside you. That's not a story unique to astronauts. It's a story that shows up in elite athletes after championships, in entrepreneurs after their companies finally succeed, in anyone who has ever pinned their sense of worth on the next achievement, certain that this one, finally, will be the one that's enough. What makes Duke's version of that story compelling isn't that he saw something extraordinary on the lunar surface. It's that he was willing to be honest, decades later, about what he didn't see there: peace, resolution, the sense of completeness he'd quietly been chasing since he was a young pilot trying to prove himself in the cockpit of an aircraft that had never flown before. He got the mission. He got the medals. He got the moment in the history books that will outlive every person reading this. And it wasn't until years afterward, in a much less cinematic setting, that he found what he'd actually been looking for all along. Charles Duke is in his 90s now, one of the small handful of people left on Earth who can say, from first-hand memory, what it felt like to stand on the surface of another world. He has spent much of his later life not chasing another achievement, but trying to tell people, plainly, without embellishment, what that whole journey actually taught him. Not that the moon holds secrets NASA won't release. Not that there's a hidden truth about the solar system waiting to be uncovered. Something much closer to home. That the things we're told will finally satisfy us often don't. And that the real turning points in a life aren't always the ones that make the headlines. 12 men have walked on the moon. Only a few of them are left to tell us, in their own words, what that experience actually meant once the parades ended and the cameras went home. Charles Duke is one of them, and the truth he eventually chose to share wasn't a discovery made in the Descartes Highlands. It was a discovery made much later, quietly, back on the world he'd left in order to prove something to himself. The realization that the thing he traveled 250,000 miles to find was never going to be found out there at all.